Hello friends! The variety of these barbaric punishments had shocked since ancient times of its inhumanity and cruelty. What they did to these prisoners in order to get from them truth. They broke their ribs, quartered them, reared them. Torture in Rus was very sophisticated. Even the West adopted the Slavic experience in the ways of savage torment. I'll tell you about 5 perhaps the most terrible and sophisticated of them. First, the type of execution was called boiling. Deal with enemies by boiling them alive, laughed Russian Tsar Ivan the Terrible. It is difficult to say where this tradition came from in Rus. Most likely, the execution was brought back in the 13th century by the troops of Genghis Khan, and already from the Mongols the Russian rulers began to take an example. Genghis Khan did not trade on trifles. He once boiled a whole tribe of his opponents in 70 huge cauldrons. In Rus, people were not boiled so massively. Ivan the Terrible preferred to act more precisely, and the number of those executed went to 10 and hundreds, but not thousands. However, the feeling of the boilers could be different, depending on from the mood of the ruler. The condemned could be heated in water, oil or wine. As a rule, traitors from the boyars, the wealthiest people, were sent to such an execution, a little less often embezzlers. Unfortunate man was placed in a huge cauldron. His hands was chained with heavy metal bracelets, after which a fire was lit under the cauldron. The boiler could heat up for about an hour, and the death of the convict was painful. The man was simply boiled alive on a slow fire. Second one, side-hanging torture. Type of death penalty in which the victim was stabbed in the inside with an iron hook and hanged. This came from thirst and blood loss after a few days. The victim's hands were tied so that it was impossible to get free. The rebels were subjected to such torture. There was also the so-called female form of punishment. They made a through hole in the breast and threaded into the wounds ropes hung on the crossbars. An interpreter often stood next to the martyr explaining for spectators for which the person is punished. Such torture ended in death, normally. People died from pain, shock and blood loss. Third one, the rising up. This torture in Rus, which was used with particular cruelty. In another way, such corporal punishment was called Russian hangout. The rack is an instrument of torture that was used to stretching of the human body. As a result of this, soft tissues were torn, limbs fell out of the joints. The prisoner experienced unbearable pain, so often the victim confessed to all the crimes, even which he did not commit. In Rus, this type of execution appeared in the 13th century. The prisoner was tied by the legs and by the hands to 2 pillars, which were connected by a crossbar. Gradually, the body began to stretch until the arms are out. Hovering time was determined each time differently, and the person could be subjected to such torture from several minutes to a couple of hours. It all depends on whether he confessed to what he had done or not. Such corporal punishments were extremely common under the rule of the Romanov dynasty. When Peter I was on the throne, rebels of archers were hung on the rack in 1698. Moreover, it was not easy for them to twist their joints, but they also beat with a whip. Tendon ruptures were common. As a result, a painful shock set in and the prisoners fell unconscious. Until he came to his senses, the torture was stopped. After this execution, the person was again set all the joints and he continued to live and work. Yeah, strange thing. Fourth one. Another harsh method of punishment is batogi. The prisoner was beaten with thick rods on which the end was cut off. They were called batogi. This corporal punishment was especially popular under the Ivan the Terrible. They resorted to it for various violations, for wrong appeal to the owner, king, or for example pity chicken thief. The victim was laid face down on the ground, one person sat on the neck and the other on his feet, so that the condemned was completely immobilized. The executioner took 2 whips in his hands and began to beat the victim on the back until he hears the truth. The torture could also be continued until the prisoner had endured all the prescribed blows. Under Ivan the Terrible, drunkenness was punished in this way. They could also be shakeless and dip their heads in ice water or put naked on an anthill. The fifth one. So, perhaps the most cruel, in my opinion, torture is a walk around the pole. Walking in a circle just sounds harmless. In fact, this is a bloody and inhuman way of killing. Its essence was as follows. A wooden post was driven into the ground in the middle of the yard. The convict was taken out into the yard and stripped to the waist. Then the unfortunate stomach was cut open. From there they took out the intestine and nailed it to a wooden pole. After that, the person had to walk in a circle, winding their insides on a post, so that the person did not resist. A guard followed him step by step. This method of execution was rarely used in Rus. It was probably borrowed from the Vikings. Often it was a ritual execution or even suicide of priests. Elderly clergy ate hallucinogenic herbs and roots, and then they independently wound their guts on a pole, allegedly sacrificing themselves to the pagan gods. But for convicts on a walk around a pillar in Rus, painkillers funds were not offered, so people could stay for hours in unconsciousness. They died most often from pain shock or blood infection. That's how terrible torture was in ancient times in Rus. So, thank you and bye bye. Subscribe please.